Hi, boys and girls. On the board behind me, I wrote text to self connections. And then I drew on top a picture of a chain. If you ever look at a chain, it has a circle, and then another circle is linked through it, and that connects them. So, circle, and then another circle that is formed that goes through that circle, so there's a link. It's a connection. They are connected together. Well, I know that when I was a little girl and I was learning to read, that I learned a lot about how to read words. But later on, when I was a grown-up, and even to a degree when I was a kid, I learned that it wasn't just the words that were important, it was the meaning. What was happening in the story? What words were being used? Did I remember that when I was done? That's just as important as being able to read the words. Sometimes we rush and we read the words without thinking, and that doesn't help us. So back when I was much younger as a teacher, they had discovered that kids could be taught to remember and to understand what they read. My teachers didn't teach us that. When I was a little girl, we would read a story and then we would answer questions. And if you could answer the questions, then you had good comprehension. If you remember, we talked about how there are different parts of reading. Comprehension means you understand what you read. But what about the kids who didn't remember the story? Did they just have to have bad comprehension? Well, when I was a kid, kind of, because it wasn't being taught. Later on, they found out that there are certain things that really good readers do that help them to remember. And we're going to talk about one of the things that really good readers do, and that way we can practice it when we're reading. We know that really good readers have text to self connections. That means that they can read a story and it reminds them of themselves, something that happens in their own life. Now, I'm going to read a story to you today, and I'm going to read the author's words, but every once in a while, I'm going to hold up my hand and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to tell you how this story connects for me, how I think about this story and my life. As we read over the next few weeks, if you are hearing a story from me and you have a connection, you can do that too, to remind yourself to think about connections. The story that I'm going to read is called The Relatives Came, and it's by Cynthia Rylant. She's the author. Stephen Gammell drew the pictures. He's the illustrator. Now, this is not a story about Thanksgiving, but when I read this story, it makes me think of Thanksgiving with my family. Growing up, I had cousins who had a dad in the Navy, and he lived all over the country. And also, I had cousins that lived like an hour or 2 hours away from me. And so we would all come together for the holidays. And that's why this makes me think of Thanksgiving. So it's called The Relatives Came. And this is a Caldecott Honor book. It has that medal. And that's telling us that this book was almost the winner for Best Pictures. So it's going to have great pictures in it. So remember, I'll read the words. And when I stop and go like this, that's me talking, not the author. It was in the summer of the year when the relatives came. They came up from Virginia. They left when their grapes were nearly purple enough to pick, but not quite. They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car, and in it they put an ice chest full of soda pop and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches, and up they came from Virginia. Now that gives me a connection, not to Thanksgiving, but to my mom and my dad. When I was a little girl, we used to go on a lot of trips out to like Colorado, California, anywhere in the western part of the United States where cowboys and Native Americans were at. My dad liked to visit, and he liked to show his kids part of the country. So we went to all these parks and different places. But we didn't have lots of money to stop and eat out all the time. So my mom would pack a big cooler, and it would sit in the back, and we had our own drinks and our own sandwiches, so we didn't have to stop and get something to eat somewhere else. So we could keep moving, but we could also save some money. So we always did that, and that reminds me of my mom. They left at 4 in the morning when it was still dark, before even the birds were awake. That reminds me of my dad, because every time we go on a road trip somewhere, we always get up when it's still dark. He likes to get a very early start in the morning so we can drive, and then around the early afternoon we can get a hotel room and relax in the evening and explore where we're at. So that reminds me of my dad. They drove all day long and into the night, and while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their almost purple grapes back home. They thought about Virginia, but they thought about us too, waiting for them. So they drank up all their pop and ate up all their crackers and traveled up all those miles until finally they pulled into our yard. Then it was hugging time. Talk about hugging. Those relatives just passed us all around their car, pulling us up against their wrinkled Virginia clothes, crying sometimes. They hugged us for hours. On Thanksgiving, sometimes I haven't seen some of my cousins and my aunts and uncles almost a year because we just don't get to see each other like we did when I was little. This reminds me of that. You walk in the door at Grandma's house, you go through the garage because that's where the driveway is. So they always leave the garage open. Everybody just walks in the garage, opens the kitchen door, and we walk in. And when you walk in, everybody gets up and comes and gets their hugs from you. Lots and lots of hugs in my family. So this really does give me a connection to my family at Thanksgiving. I bet lots of you have that too. Then it was into the house, and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front room. Those relatives. This reminds me of Thanksgiving. I have a connection to this. You know, as our family has grown, it's really hard to get through the house without running into someone. It used to be just my mom and my dad and my grandma and my cousins. But now it's my mom, my dad, my cousins, their husbands and their kids, and it's just our family has really grown. And so there's so many more people that when you try to walk from the kitchen to the living room, you might get a hug or a hello or a handshake or a pat on the back or a question from any number of people. It's just so much more crowded. But it's a wonderful kind of crowded, isn't it? I miss that kind of crowded. And finally, after a big supper, 2 or 3 times around, until we all got a turn at the table, there was quiet talk, and we were in 2s and 3s through the house. This reminds me of being at Thanksgiving with my family, being in 2s and 3s. What that means is when you're at Grandma's house and you look over in that corner, there might be my dad and my Uncle Bob and my Uncle Dave talking. telling jokes probably and big stories like they always do. In another corner, you might see my mom and my Aunt Barbara and my Aunt Mary because they're sisters and they like to sit together and talk. And then in another corner, you might see me with my cousins Jennifer and Holly because the three of us were close in age and we always did everything together when we were little. So we were close. So there'd be like little groups of 2 or 3. You might see some of the kids together talking, like my nieces and my cousin's daughters and my cousin's son. They might be together in a little group of 3 over here, 3 over here, 2 over here. Everybody kind of splits up so they can sit down and get to talking. So that really reminds me of Thanksgiving at Grandma's. The relatives weren't particular about beds, which was good since there weren't any extras. So a few squeezed in with us, and the rest slept on the floor, some with their arms thrown over the closest person, or some with an arm across one person and a leg across another. It was different going to sleep with all that new breathing in the house. I love the sound of that. You know, when you're in a house with your family and you go to bed, I really miss that about living with my parents because when I was a little girl and even in high school, my bedroom was across from my mom and my dad's. So we would go to bed at night and our doors would be open, and I can remember hearing my dad breathe. It was probably not healthy breathing because he's a very loud breather, but I do remember going to sleep at night hearing the sound of his breathing. It's just comfortable. So when you're staying, and you know, when we would have relatives that visited us when I was a kid, you know, you could hear them breathing in the next room. It's just kind of a nice feeling when you know that someone you love is there. You know, like I've heard you guys talk about your grandmas and grandpas coming to visit, and I bet that feels pretty good to you to hear the sound of them breathing in your house and just knowing they're there. The relatives stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us tend the garden, and they fixed any broken things they could find. So remember, this is not exactly a Thanksgiving story. It just makes me have connections to Thanksgiving. They ate up all our strawberries and melons, then promised we could eat up all their grapes and peaches when we came to Virginia. So they got a little work and they got a little play. Helping each other out. I love that. But none of us thought about Virginia much. We were so busy hugging and eating and breathing together. Finally, after a long time, the relatives loaded up their ice chest. That's the same thing as a cooler. And they headed back to Virginia at 4 in the morning. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them off in the dark. We watched the relatives disappear down the road. Then we crawled back into our beds that felt too big and too quiet. We fell asleep. So that makes me have a connection. Anytime I'm with my family for any extra time, like they stay over or they visit, it is very quiet when they leave. They said the beds felt too big. You know, they're missing their relatives being in their beds. That the house was too quiet. When I think of that, I have a connection because I know that it was always just a little sad when family would leave. Sometimes they would stay at our house when they would come up to visit, especially like my mom's cousin Juanita. Juanita used to stay at my house all the time, and so having her in our house was a special treat. But then when she left, we missed her because she had been there with us and we talked and hugged and loved, and it's hard when people go away that we love. There's like a little empty space. And the relatives drove on all day long and into the night, And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. But they thought about us too, missing them, and they missed us. And when they were finally home in Virginia, they crawled into their silent, soft beds and dreamed about the next summer. You have a good time. You're always excited for the next one. And there, the grapes are purple. So when I read this story, it really does make me think about a lot of things that have happened in my life. I have a lot of connections. I can make a bunch of different connections about my life to the story. Text means the words on the pages. So text to self, the words on the pages, to my life, myself. Those things connect. When you're reading or listening to stories and something that you hear reminds you of your life, you are making a text to self connection. I would be willing to bet that some of you made connections to this story we read today. I bet if you didn't today, that next week, if you celebrate Thanksgiving, there might be some things in this story that remind you of your own life. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you soon. Bye.